Rio 2 2014. Rio 2 looks like the kind of sequel that should be simple. Take the characters audiences already love, give them a bigger location, add more songs, more jokes, more colorful animals, and send them on another adventure. But beneath all that noise, Rio 2 is actually asking a much more complicated question. What happens when the life you built becomes so comfortable that you start forgetting the part of yourself you were never taught to understand? Blue has almost everything he could have wanted. He has Jewel. He has 3 children. He has a home, human companionship, food, safety, and a world designed around his needs. And yet the moment Jewel discovers that other Spixas may still exist, that comfortable life suddenly feels incomplete. For Jewel, the discovery is a chance to reconnect with the world she came from. For Blue, it feels almost like a threat. Because if Jewel and the children discover a different version of life, what happens if they decide that Blue no longer belongs in it? That is the quiet insecurity sitting underneath Rio 2's bright colors and non-stop comedy. Blue is no longer afraid of being trapped in a cage. Now he is afraid of becoming the cage. He wants to protect his family so badly that he risks controlling the very people he loves. And Jewel's journey into the Amazon forces him to confront something he has spent his entire life avoiding. He may never fit perfectly into one world. The Amazon itself becomes a reflection of that conflict. To Jewel, it is home. To Blue, it is beautiful, dangerous, unfamiliar, and full of people who seem to understand something about themselves that he does not. The rainforest represents freedom, but freedom can also be terrifying when you have spent years building your identity around safety. And then there is Nigel, whose own identity has been reduced to one obsession: revenge. His story is exaggerated for comedy, but underneath the ridiculousness is another version of the same problem. Nigel cannot imagine himself without the humiliation Blue represents. Where Blue is terrified of losing the people who define him, Nigel is terrified of becoming irrelevant without the enemy he has chosen to define himself against. Rio 2 therefore expands the first film's romantic story into something much broader. The question is no longer simply whether Blue and Jewel can find each other. They already have. Now the question is whether they can build a family without forcing every member of that family to become the same thing. Can you belong somewhere without knowing where you came from? Can you honor your roots without abandoning the life you created? And can you protect a place without treating it as something you own? Those questions are hidden inside a movie that, on the surface, appears to be about birds singing in the jungle. That is what makes Rio 2 worth revisiting. Instead of treating it as nothing more than another animated sequel, we can look at how the film constructs its ideas through character behavior, setting, comedy, music, animation, and conflict. The move from Rio de Janeiro to the Amazon is not simply an attempt to make the sequel bigger. It changes the psychological environment of the entire story. In the first film, Blue's central problem was his fear of the outside world. The city represented danger, while Linda represented safety. By the beginning of Rio 2, Blue has adapted so completely to human civilization that the equation has almost reversed. The city is now home. The Amazon becomes the unknown. Jewel, meanwhile, experiences the opposite transformation. What looks threatening to Blue feels familiar to her. Her excitement exposes just how differently the two characters understand belonging. From there, the story introduces Eduardo, a character who represents an extreme version of traditional identity. Eduardo believes there is a correct way to be a macaw, and Blue clearly does not fit his definition. Roberto then becomes another trigger for Blue's insecurity because Roberto seems to embody everything Blue thinks he lacks: confidence, athletic ability, social ease, and familiarity with the wild. Meanwhile, Nigel carries an entirely separate revenge narrative that mirrors the main story in a strangely comic way. His obsession is not about finding where he belongs anymore. It is about destroying the person he believes took his place. At the same time, the Amazon is facing a threat that transforms the personal conflict into something larger. The characters are not simply arguing about lifestyle. They are confronting the possibility that the environment itself could be destroyed. This allows Rio 2 to connect family identity with ecological responsibility. The film's music, Brazilian influences, bright colors, and enormous flock sequences make that message accessible without turning the movie into a lecture. And that balance is important because Rio 2 works best when its serious ideas are hiding inside entertainment rather than stopping the entertainment completely. This analysis is not about pretending the sequel is flawless. It is about understanding why a messy animated film can still contain meaningful ideas, and why those ideas may become easier to see after growing up. If you watched Rio 2 as a child, there is a good chance you remembered the obvious things first. The songs, the jokes, the colorful birds, Nigel's ridiculous revenge plan, Blue trying to survive in the jungle, the giant groups of macaws flying through the sky. Maybe you remembered one of the musical numbers before you remembered what the movie was actually about. That is normal. Early 2010s animation was often designed to work on two levels. Children could experience the surface adventure, while adults could recognize themes about family, identity, responsibility, and change. But revisiting these films years later can produce a strange feeling. The movie has not changed. You have. A story that once looked like an adventure about birds can suddenly look like a story about parents worrying that their children are growing away from them. A joke about Blue being uncomfortable in the jungle can suddenly resemble the anxiety of someone entering a social environment where everyone else seems to understand the rules. Jules' desire to reconnect with her roots can feel less like a plot device and more like the universal experience of wondering where you came from. And Blue's fear of change can become painfully familiar, because adulthood eventually teaches us that stability is not the same thing as happiness. Sometimes the life that feels safest is also the life that prevents us from discovering something important about ourselves. That is one reason Rio 2 can hit differently when you are older. The film is not only about birds leaving one environment and entering another. It is about the uncomfortable moment when the definition of home stops being simple. As children, home is usually somewhere other people define for us. As we grow older, we start asking whether that definition actually belongs to us. We begin separating family expectations from personal identity. We notice the difference between tradition and pressure. We become more aware of environmental destruction and what it means for places we may never personally visit. And suddenly the Amazon in Rio 2 is not just a beautiful background. It becomes a place representing everything that can disappear when people treat nature as an obstacle instead of a living system. There are details in this movie that are easy to miss because the film moves so quickly. Its loudest jokes can distract from its quietest ideas. And that is exactly why looking at Rio 2 again is interesting. The deeper you look, the more the film stops being simply a sequel about returning birds and starts becoming a story about what it means to belong to more than one world. Part 2. Context Background. Rio 2 arrived because the first Rio had established something commercially and culturally useful. A recognizable animated world built around Brazilian culture, music, bright visual design, and a lovable central character. Blue Sky Studios already had a reputation for creating distinctive animated properties, but Rio gave the studio an opportunity to build a franchise around a setting that felt different from the suburban, fairy tale, or fantasy environments dominating much of mainstream animation. The original film introduced Blue as a domesticated Spix's macaw, who had spent most of his life away from his natural environment. His journey with Jewel turned the city of Rio de Janeiro into a character in its own right. The sequel therefore faced an obvious creative problem. If Blue and Jewel had already found each other, what conflict could possibly justify another movie? The easiest answer would have been to repeat the first film. Another kidnapping, another journey, another romance, another villain. But Rio 2 chooses a different direction. Instead of separating Blue and Jewel, it gives them a family. Instead of taking them through the same city, it sends them into the Amazon. Instead of making romance the central question, it asks what happens after romance has already succeeded. This is an important sequel strategy because the story has to grow with its characters. Blue is no longer the lonely bird who needs to discover love. He is a father. Jewel is no longer simply the wild bird teaching him how to live. She is now a mother confronting the possibility that her children are growing up without understanding the heritage she considers essential. The addition of Carla, Bia, and Tiago expands the emotional stakes because Blue and Jewel are no longer making choices only for themselves. Every disagreement becomes a parenting disagreement. Every question about identity becomes a question about what their children should inherit. Carlos Saldanha's return as director is also significant, because his Brazilian background gives the film an authentic connection to the cultural environment it portrays. Saldanha's work on the Rio franchise was always built around movement, music, color, and Brazilian imagery, and the sequel allows those elements to expand beyond the urban landscape. The Amazon gives the animation team a much larger canvas. Instead of recognizable buildings and city streets, the movie can explore enormous trees, rivers, cliffs, vegetation, wildlife, and massive flocks of birds moving through open space. But the visual expansion creates another challenge. Bigger does not automatically mean better. A sequel can become visually larger while emotionally smaller. If the film simply piles on locations and characters without deepening the central conflict, the world becomes spectacle without meaning. Rio 2 avoids that problem at its best moments by making the Amazon directly relevant to Blue and Jewel's relationship. The rainforest is where Jewel's past becomes visible, and Blue's uncertainty becomes unavoidable. It is also where the children can encounter a culture and environment different from the one they have known. The new characters therefore do more than populate the sequel. Eduardo represents an older generation's understanding of identity. Roberto represents social confidence. The children represent the next generation, who can potentially combine both worlds. That structure gives the movie an opportunity to explore how identity is passed down, challenged, and reinvented. The early 2010s were also an important period for animated franchises. Studios increasingly understood that a successful animated film was not necessarily a one-time experience. Recognizable characters could return, merchandise could expand, songs could circulate outside the movie, and families could become repeat customers. A sequel like Rio 2 therefore had a clear commercial logic. Audiences already knew Blue and Jewel. The voice cast was familiar. The visual identity was established. The music provided promotional material. And the Amazon setting offered an easy way to communicate that this was not simply more of the first movie. Marketing could sell the idea immediately. The birds were back, but this time they were going into the wild. The return of established performers also helped maintain continuity, while new characters gave the campaign fresh faces. The Amazon itself became perhaps the biggest selling point. It promised a more adventurous story, more animals, more spectacle, and a new environment for the franchise. Yet that marketing creates an interesting contrast with the movie's deeper themes. A trailer can easily sell a colorful jungle adventure. It is much harder to sell a story about inherited identity, parental anxiety, cultural belonging, and ecological responsibility. Those ideas are discovered after the audience enters the movie. The sequel therefore sits between two expectations. Viewers want the recognizable fun of Rio, but they also expect a sequel to justify its existence by expanding the world. Rio 2 tries to satisfy both demands at once, and that tension explains both its ambition and some of its weaknesses. The film is constantly trying to be bigger, funnier, more musical, more emotional, and more meaningful than its predecessor. Sometimes those ambitions complement each other. Sometimes they compete. Part 3 Story Recap. At the beginning of Rio 2, the most important thing about Blue is not what he lacks. It is what he has gained. The frightened macaw from the first movie now lives with Jewel and their 3 children, Carla, Bia, and Tiago. Their family life is comfortable, playful, and deeply connected to the human world. Blue has adapted to civilization so thoroughly that many of the things that once seemed strange now feel completely normal to him. He knows how to navigate a household. He understands human routines. He is comfortable around Linda and Tulio. He has built an environment where his children can grow up protected from many of the dangers that once terrified him. From Blue's perspective, this is success. He has created exactly the kind of security he once needed. But Jewel sees a problem. Her children are becoming increasingly connected to human habits, and she worries that they are losing something fundamental about their natural identity. For Jewel, being a macaw is not merely a biological fact. It is a connection to a larger community, a landscape, and a way of life. She does not want her children to grow up believing that the human environment is the only world available to them. Blue does not necessarily disagree with the value of nature, but his priorities are different. He believes safety matters. He believes family matters. And because he spent so much of his life feeling helpless, he has developed a deep attachment to the things that make life predictable. That difference between Blue and Jewel is established before the adventure even begins. They love the same children, but they imagine the ideal childhood differently. Then comes the discovery that changes everything. There may be other Spixes Macas living in the Amazon. Suddenly the question of identity becomes concrete. Jewel may not be the last of her kind. Her children may have an opportunity to meet others like themselves. The discovery excites her because it offers something she never knew she could have again: a connection to a larger family. Blue reacts very differently. To him, the Amazon is an unknown environment full of risks. But because he loves Jewel, he agrees to go. This is important because Blue's journey is not initially driven by curiosity. It is driven by loyalty. He is willing to enter a world he does not understand because he wants to remain beside the people he loves. Yet the moment they arrive, he discovers that love alone does not guarantee belonging. The Amazon is beautiful, enormous, and alive. For the children, it is an adventure. For Jewel, it feels like a return. For Blue, it feels like an examination he has not studied for. He meets Eduardo, Jewel's father and a powerful figure within the macaw community. Eduardo immediately sees Blue as an outsider. Blue may be a macaw biologically, but Eduardo's standards are cultural and behavioral. Blue has spent too much time around humans. He does not move like the other birds. He does not behave like them. He is comfortable with objects and habits that Eduardo sees as evidence of weakness. Eduardo's judgment hits Blue exactly where he is most vulnerable. Blue has spent his entire life adapting. Now his greatest survival skill is being treated as proof that he is not authentic enough. Roberto makes that insecurity worse. Roberto is confident, athletic, charismatic, and naturally accepted within the group. Blue immediately interprets him as competition, particularly because Roberto has history with Jewel. The threat is partly imaginary, but that is what makes it psychologically effective. Blue does not need Roberto to actively steal Jewel for Roberto to make him feel insecure. Blue simply has to compare himself with someone who seems to possess the qualities he believes he lacks. The baseball-style competition between the macaws turns that insecurity into comedy. Blue tries to prove himself, but the more he tries to behave like the other birds, the more obvious it becomes that he is forcing an identity rather than living naturally. Meanwhile, Jewel becomes increasingly immersed in her old world. She reconnects with the rhythms of the community, the landscape, and the traditions that Eduardo represents. For her, the experience is liberating. For Blue, it is frightening because every moment that makes Jewel feel more at home seems to remind him that he is less at home. This creates one of the sequel's most interesting emotional contradictions. Jewel is not trying to leave Blue behind. She is trying to recover a part of herself. But Blue experiences her rediscovery as a possible rejection of the life they created together. The children also begin responding differently to their new surroundings. Carla, Bia, and Tiago are young enough to adapt quickly. They do not carry the same psychological baggage as their parents. They can be fascinated by the new world without constantly asking whether they belong in it. That makes them an important contrast to Blue. Children often treat identity as something flexible. Adults tend to treat it as something they have already decided. The movie uses that difference for comedy, but it also quietly suggests that the next generation may be better equipped to combine worlds, rather than choose between them. As Blue struggles to integrate into the macaw community, another threat begins to emerge. The rainforest is not simply a peaceful sanctuary waiting for the birds to return. Human expansion and logging threaten the environment. Suddenly the conflict becomes larger than Blue's personal insecurity. The family is now part of a community facing a danger that could destroy the place they have just discovered. This allows the story to connect the idea of belonging with responsibility. If the Amazon is home to these birds, protecting it becomes inseparable from protecting the family. At the same time, Nigel's storyline develops in parallel. Still humiliated by what happened in the previous film, Nigel is obsessed with revenge against Blue. His obsession has become almost comically complete. He no longer simply dislikes Blue. He has organized his identity around defeating him. Gabby, meanwhile, is deeply devoted to Nigel despite his obvious lack of interest in her romantic feelings. Their relationship creates a bizarre mirror of the main story. Blue is afraid that love can disappear if he is not good enough. Nigel cannot understand that love may exist independently of his obsession with revenge. Blue wants to preserve a relationship by changing himself. Nigel wants to validate himself by destroying someone else. As the family adjusts to the Amazon, Blue's behavior becomes increasingly controlled by fear. Eduardo's criticism makes him question his masculinity and his identity. Roberto's confidence makes him jealous. Jewel's happiness makes him nervous. His children's excitement makes him realize that they may love this world in ways he cannot fully understand. Instead of recognizing that his family can belong to multiple places, Blue initially interprets every sign of change as a threat to the life he built. The irony is that he is trying to protect his family from losing him while his fear itself begins creating distance. The environmental conflict continues growing. The rainforest is being damaged, and the macaques face the possibility of losing their habitat. The story now has 3 overlapping conflicts: Blue versus his own insecurity, the family versus internal division, and the macaque community versus outside destruction. These conflicts are connected because each asks the same basic question: what are you willing to protect and why? Blue's lowest emotional point comes when he realizes that he cannot control everything. He cannot force Jewel to experience the Amazon the way he does. He cannot make Eduardo approve of him simply by pretending to be wild. He cannot guarantee that his children will remain exactly as they are. And he cannot protect his family by hiding them from change. This is where the sequel's central lesson begins to emerge. Courage is not the absence of fear. For Blue, courage means accepting that his family can change without disappearing. The final conflict brings the different storylines together. The macaques unite against the threat to their habitat, and Blue discovers that the qualities Eduardo dismissed are exactly what the community needs. His experience in the human world has given him skills and perspectives the others do not possess. Instead of becoming more like Eduardo or Roberto, Blue becomes useful by being himself. Jewel and Blue work together, combining their different strengths. Eduardo begins to recognize that Blue's differences are not evidence of weakness. They are another form of survival. Nigel's revenge plot reaches its absurd conclusion, with Gabby playing an unexpected role in his downfall. His obsession finally collapses because it has nothing constructive at its center. While Blue learns to expand his identity, Nigel remains trapped inside a single emotion. Blue survives by adapting. Nigel destroys himself through fixation. That contrast is one of the sequel's clearest examples of how 2 characters can face insecurity in completely opposite ways. Once the immediate threat is addressed, the family conflict can finally settle. Blue does not need to become wild. Jewel does not need to abandon the family they built. Their children do not need to choose between human influence and natural heritage. The family can carry both worlds. Returning to Rio therefore means something different than it did before. They are not simply going home. They are bringing a new understanding of home with them. Rio is still part of who they are, but the Amazon is now part of them too. And that is where Blue's journey ultimately lands. Belonging was never about proving that he deserved a particular environment. It was about realizing that his life could connect environments that seemed incompatible. He could be a macaque shaped by humans and still be a macaque. He could love Jewel without becoming Jewel. He could be a father without controlling his children. And he could protect nature without pretending he had never belonged to civilization. Part 4. Character Analysis. Blue is one of the more interesting animated protagonists precisely because his greatest strength and greatest weakness are the same thing. He adapts. In the first film, adaptation saves him. He learns to move through Rio, confront danger, trust Jewel, and eventually embrace a part of himself that had been suppressed by captivity. By the second film, however, adaptation has gone so far that it becomes another form of insecurity. Blue has adapted to the human world so completely that he is no longer sure whether he can survive anywhere else. The problem is not that he lacks courage. It is that his courage is often reactive. He becomes brave when someone he loves is in danger, but he struggles when he is asked to accept uncertainty without immediately trying to control it. His surface goal throughout Rio 2 is obvious: protect his family. But underneath that goal is another one that he rarely admits. He wants to prove that he belongs. Eduardo's judgment makes that desire impossible to ignore. Blue wants Jewel's family to respect him. He wants his children to see him as capable. He wants Jewel to continue choosing him, even after discovering a world that existed before he was part of it. This makes his insecurity understandable. Blue's fear of abandonment began long before he became a husband and father. His early life taught him that separation could happen without warning. As a result, when he finally builds a stable family, stability becomes incredibly valuable to him. That is why comedy becomes such an important defense mechanism. Blue often responds to anxiety through awkwardness, over-planning, or humor. Instead of admitting that he feels inadequate, he tries to solve the situation practically. Instead of saying that he is afraid Jewel may prefer another world, he becomes jealous of Roberto. Instead of accepting that his children are growing, he tries to protect them from risk. His behavior can be funny because the audience can see the emotional truth underneath the absurdity. Jewel functions as both Blue's partner and his thematic opposite. She represents the part of identity that cannot be reduced to comfort. She understands that love and safety are valuable, but she also knows that a person can lose something by never returning to their roots. Her journey is not about rejecting Blue. It is about refusing to let her relationship with Blue erase her history. That distinction is crucial. Jewel's desire to reconnect with her species is not proof that her family life is inadequate. It is proof that identity has layers. Eduardo becomes the perfect trigger for Blue because he embodies everything Blue thinks he is not. Eduardo is physically confident, culturally rooted, protective, and authoritative. He does not have to ask whether he belongs. He assumes he does. Blue's reaction is therefore partly admiration disguised as resentment. He wants Eduardo's approval because that approval would seem to settle the question he cannot settle internally. Am I enough? Roberto triggers a different insecurity. Eduardo challenges Blue's identity. Roberto challenges his confidence. Roberto appears to be naturally comfortable in the world where Blue struggles. He is social, athletic, and familiar with Jewel's past. Blue interprets him as competition because he is already competing with an imaginary version of himself. If Blue believes there is a perfect macaw out there, Roberto seems dangerously close to being that person. But Blue eventually discovers that adaptation is not a flaw. His ability to understand both human civilization and macaw life makes him uniquely valuable. The movie's most important idea about him is that he does not have to erase one identity to validate another. His hybrid experience becomes his strength. In a world that keeps asking characters to choose sides, Blue becomes the character who proves that combination can be its own form of authenticity. Eduardo, meanwhile, deserves more nuance than simply being labeled the strict father who dislikes Blue. His hostility comes from protection. He represents a generation that has watched a species become endangered, and therefore feels an enormous pressure to preserve its identity. When something is threatened with extinction, tradition can begin to feel like survival. Eduardo's insistence on the old ways therefore has an understandable emotional foundation. He fears that if the macaws become too comfortable around humans, they will lose the qualities that make them distinct. The problem is that protection can become rigidity. Eduardo sometimes treats cultural identity as though it were a fixed checklist. If Blue behaves differently, he is considered lesser. But identity does not remain untouched simply because we want it to. Cultures change. Families change. Individuals change. Eduardo's journey therefore parallels Blue's. Blue must learn that his differences do not make him inferior, while Eduardo must learn that difference does not automatically mean destruction. Nigel represents a much darker version of identity fixation. After the first film, he has one purpose: revenge. His humiliation becomes his personality. That is why his storyline is so exaggerated. The movie turns obsession into comedy, but the underlying idea is surprisingly serious. Nigel cannot move forward because he has made the past his entire identity. Every decision he makes is still about Blue. Even when Blue is not present, Nigel's life revolves around him. Gabi's relationship with Nigel adds another layer, because she sees him through romantic idealization. She is capable of affection that Nigel cannot properly receive. Her devotion becomes part of the comedy, but it also emphasizes how obsession distorts perception. Gabby sees qualities in Nigel that may not exist in the way she imagines them. Nigel sees Blue as a monster who ruined his life. Both characters are trapped inside emotional narratives they have created. That makes Eduardo and Nigel surprisingly effective thematic contrasts. Eduardo is obsessed with preserving identity. Nigel is obsessed with avenging identity. Eduardo looks backward because he fears losing his culture. Nigel looks backward because he cannot accept humiliation. Blue also looks backward, but eventually learns to integrate the past into the present. The three characters therefore demonstrate different responses to insecurity, rigidity, obsession, and adaptation. The supporting cast keeps these ideas from becoming too heavy. Jewel remains the emotional center because she understands both the value of family and the importance of roots. Linda and Tulio connect the human and bird worlds, demonstrating that the boundary between civilization and nature is more complicated than the movie's jokes sometimes suggest. Carla, Bia, and Tiago represent different forms of childhood development. Carla carries responsibility. Bia approaches the world through curiosity and intelligence. Tiago embodies adventurous innocence. Together, they show what identity looks like before adults have fully decided what it is supposed to mean. Raphael provides comic wisdom, while Louise exists largely as physical comedy, but both contribute to the film's tonal balance. The movie can discuss endangered habitats in one sequence and immediately return to ridiculous animal humor in the next. That can create tonal inconsistency, but it also serves a purpose. Younger viewers are allowed to experience the story as entertainment, while adults can recognize the more serious material beneath it. Ultimately, Rio 2's ensemble works because almost every major character represents a different answer to the same question. Jewel says belonging includes your roots. Eduardo says belonging requires loyalty to tradition. Blue initially believes belonging requires adaptation to whatever environment keeps his family safe. Roberto demonstrates effortless social belonging. Nigel demonstrates what happens when belonging is replaced by obsession. And the children quietly suggest another possibility. Perhaps belonging does not have to be a single category at all. Part 5 themes symbolism. The central theme of Rio 2 is belonging, but the film refuses to define belonging in one simple way. Is belonging biological? Is it cultural? Is it emotional? Is it geographical? Or is it something we create through the relationships we choose? Blue and Jewel answer these questions differently. Jewel feels that ancestry matters because it connects a person to a history larger than themselves. Blue believes experience matters because the life you build can become just as meaningful as the life you were born into. Their conflict is therefore not really about nature versus civilization. It is about whether identity can contain both. Family complicates that question further. Blue and Jewel are raising children who inherit different parts of both parents. The children are biologically macaques, but their environment has been shaped by humans. They are growing up with experiences neither Blue nor Jewel had in exactly the same way. This makes them symbols of a new generation. They do not have to choose the past or present because both already exist inside their upbringing. That is why parental expectations become important. Blue wants to protect his children, but protection can become control. Jewel wants her children to know their heritage, but heritage can become pressure if it is treated as a requirement rather than an opportunity. Both parents are trying to give their children something valuable. Both can also accidentally impose their own fears on them. The film's nature versus civilization conflict works best when it avoids treating either side as completely good or bad. Civilization gave Blue a home. It gave him safety, relationships, food, and stability. Nature gives Jewel connection, freedom, and cultural identity. Neither world is presented as sufficient by itself. The real problem comes when one world assumes it has to eliminate the other. The environmental theme follows naturally from this idea. The Amazon is not simply a beautiful place that the birds happen to live in. It is a system that supports them. When humans destroy the habitat, they are not merely changing scenery. They are threatening the conditions that make an entire community possible. The film's conservation message is therefore connected to its family story. To protect the macaws, the characters must understand that home is valuable, even when they do not personally own it. The visual language reinforces these ideas. Rio's urban environments are structured, colorful, and filled with human architecture. The Amazon is organic, layered, unpredictable, and enormous. Blue visually belongs to both. His blue feathers connect him naturally to the sky, but his behavior often connects him to the human environment. In the Amazon, he is surrounded by green, a color that visually dominates the frame and makes him appear simultaneously visible and out of place. Birds naturally become symbols of freedom, because flight represents movement without borders. A bird can cross a city, forest, river, or mountain without asking where one world ends and another begins. But Rio too complicates that symbol. Freedom is not always comfortable. Blue has freedom in the Amazon, yet he feels less secure. A cage is physically restrictive, but uncertainty can create an invisible cage inside the mind. The film repeatedly uses enclosed spaces and open skies to contrast control and freedom. When the birds fly together, individuality becomes part of a larger movement. The flock is both a community and a visual representation of belonging. Blue initially struggles because he thinks he must match everyone else. Eventually he learns that being part of a group does not require identical behavior. Clothing and human objects also become identity markers. Blue's comfort with human things visually separates him from the wild macaws, but the movie does not ultimately say those objects make him less authentic. They show his history. They are evidence of where he has been. The question is whether history is something to hide or something to integrate. The deeper argument of Rio 2 is therefore about hybrid identity. Blue does not need to reject civilization to become a real macaw. Jewel does not need to reject her family to reconnect with the Amazon. Their children do not need to erase either influence. Identity can be cumulative. A person can be shaped by multiple places and still belong fully to each experience. Eduardo's rigid worldview provides the counterargument. Tradition can preserve a threatened culture. But tradition can also become restrictive when it assumes that every generation must live exactly like the previous one. This is especially important when considering the film's environmental message. Protecting nature should not mean pretending humans and nature can never interact. The more useful idea is stewardship, recognizing that the natural world is not property simply because humans can enter it. That perspective also gives the Amazon greater symbolic importance. It is not merely a backdrop for adventure. It represents a world that existed before the characters arrived, and will continue to exist beyond them. The characters can belong there without owning it. That distinction mirrors the film's understanding of family. We do not own the people we love. We participate in their lives, protect them when we can, and allow them to remain individuals. And that may be the film's most interesting philosophical question. What makes someone belong? Is it birth, behavior, memory, love, community, choice? Rio 2 never gives one explicit answer because its characters provide different possibilities. Blue's answer is eventually the most flexible. Belonging is not about proving that you are exactly like everyone else. It is about understanding what you bring to the place and the people you care about. Part 6: Production Breakdown. Visually, Rio 2 represents a major expansion of the franchise's playground. The first film had the enormous advantage of Rio de Janeiro's recognizable architecture, coastline, streets, and carnival energy. The sequel moves into an environment that is much less structured from a cinematic standpoint. The Amazon is visually dense. Trees, water, leaves, animals, mist, rocks, and sunlight can fill almost every frame. The challenge is not making the environment look beautiful. It is making it readable. Blue Sky's animation approach relies heavily on clarity and exaggeration. The bird characters have highly expressive faces, distinct silhouettes, and physical behaviors that make their personalities understandable, even during fast-moving sequences. Blue's body language is particularly important because so much of his comedy comes from the difference between how he wants to appear and how he actually moves. He can be brave in intention and completely awkward in execution. Feather detail becomes more important in a setting where the characters are surrounded by natural textures. Against the green rainforest, the saturated colors of the macaws become visual punctuation. The flock sequences can then transform dozens or hundreds of individual birds into a moving visual pattern. This is where animation becomes more than character illustration. The movement of the flock communicates scale, freedom, and community simultaneously. The Amazon also allows the film to experiment with lighting. Sunlight filtering through vegetation creates layers that a city environment cannot provide in the same way. Water reflects color and movement. The contrast between bright skies and deep forest shadows gives the setting a sense of depth. These choices are especially useful during musical sequences because the environment can move with the rhythm. Physical comedy remains one of the film's most important animation tools. Birds are naturally expressive because flight, balance, landing, and wing movement create opportunities for exaggerated motion. Blue's awkwardness becomes part of the visual storytelling. When he fails at something the other macaws do effortlessly, the animation communicates his insecurity before he even says anything. The environmental destruction scenes require a different visual language. Trees being cut down are not simply objects falling. They represent the disruption of the environment that the film has spent so much time presenting as alive. The contrast between lush natural spaces and damaged landscapes gives the conservation message its visual foundation. Carlos Saldaña's direction ties these elements together by maintaining the energetic personality of the original while changing the scale of the world. The sequel does not try to abandon the identity of Rio. It expands it. Brazilian culture remains central through music, movement, character design, humor, and setting, while the Amazon introduces a different kind of Brazilian environment. The directing challenge is therefore one of balance. Too much comedy would make the environmental threat meaningless. Too much environmental drama would make the movie feel heavier than its target audience expects. Too much family conflict would crowd out the adventure. Too much spectacle would make the characters emotionally irrelevant. Rio 2 constantly moves between these extremes. Its fast pacing is part of that strategy. The film rarely allows a single emotional register to dominate for too long. A serious conversation can be followed by a joke. A musical sequence can be followed by an action beat. A family disagreement can be interrupted by physical comedy. This can make the story feel crowded, but it also creates the energetic tone associated with the franchise. The musical set pieces are particularly important to Saldaña's approach because they combine character, culture, animation, and spectacle in one sequence. Instead of stopping the narrative, the best musical moments reveal how characters understand the world. A song can tell us what a character wants while the animation shows us how that desire fits into the larger environment. The result is a sequel that feels visually larger without completely losing its identity. The Amazon is not Rio repeated with trees. It has a different texture, rhythm, and emotional purpose. The city represented the world Blue had learned to understand. The rainforest represents the world he must learn to accept. Part 7 Music Sound. Music is one of Rio 2's defining storytelling tools because the franchise's identity has always been inseparable from rhythm. John Powell's score works alongside Brazilian-inspired musical elements to give the film a continuous sense of movement. Even when the characters are standing still, the soundscape often feels alive. Percussion, rhythmic patterns, orchestral energy, and dance-oriented arrangements keep the movie moving forward. That musical energy also helps solve a storytelling problem. Rio 2 contains a large number of characters and several competing storylines. Music provides a unifying language. The characters may have different motivations, but when they enter a musical sequence, the film can temporarily place them inside the same rhythm. This becomes particularly useful in the Amazon because the environment itself feels musical. Birds, insects, water, wind, and movement create natural patterns. The score can build on that feeling rather than treating the rainforest as silent scenery. Brazilian musical influences therefore become part of the world building. Music also distinguishes emotional environments. Intimate family moments can use softer arrangements, while group sequences become larger and more percussive. Action scenes can synchronize movement with rhythm, making physical events feel almost choreographed. That connection between music and animation is one reason the film often feels more energetic than its story structure might suggest. Songs such as What is Love? Contribute to the emotional side of the movie by turning character feelings into something external and performative. The song does not simply tell the audience what a character thinks. It transforms the feeling into an event. Beautiful creatures and other musical moments similarly reinforce the film's fascination with nature, attraction, identity, and community. Welcome Back carries an especially relevant emotional idea because the sequel is fundamentally about returning. Characters are reconnecting with people, places, and parts of themselves that were separated from them. The concept of returning therefore exists at several levels. Returning to a homeland, returning to family, returning to a cultural identity, and returning to a version of yourself you thought you had lost. Wildlife fits the movie's larger conflict between the controlled and uncontrolled worlds. The idea of wildness is attractive, funny, and frightening at the same time. Blue wants to understand it without knowing whether he can live inside it. I Will Survive adds another layer because survival is one of the film's recurring concepts. The characters are surviving environmental threats, emotional insecurity, changing relationships, and personal fears. The song's energy turns survival into comedy and confidence, which is very much in keeping with the film's ability to hide serious themes inside entertainment. Sound design completes this physical world. Wing movements need to feel different from human movement. Birds landing, flying, colliding, and moving through vegetation create their own sonic identity. The rainforest should never feel empty. Even during dialogue, environmental sounds can remind us that the characters are surrounded by life. Bird calls, insects, water, wind, and vegetation create a sense of depth. When the film moves into action, those sounds become more aggressive. When silence appears, it becomes noticeable because the environment has trained the audience to expect constant activity. Comedy depends heavily on sound as well. A fall can be made funnier by timing. A character's movement can become more ridiculous through exaggerated impact sounds. Nigel's physical behavior can be amplified by sound effects that make his revenge attempts feel intentionally theatrical. The most effective moments occur when sound does not simply decorate the image, but tells us how the world feels. The Amazon is not only green. It is loud, layered, rhythmic, and constantly moving. The city is not only concrete. It has human noise, technology, traffic, and routines. Blue exists between those soundscapes, just as he exists between those identities. Part 8. Cultural impact. When Rio 2 was released, it arrived with the advantages and disadvantages of a recognizable animated franchise. Audiences already knew Blue and Jewel, so the sequel did not have to spend an entire movie convincing viewers to care about its central characters. Families could return to a familiar world. The colorful animation, musical sequences, and animal comedy gave the film immediate accessibility. The Amazon setting also created a strong promotional identity. Even before viewers understood the story's themes, they could understand the basic premise. The birds were leaving the city and entering the jungle. That is visually simple and commercially useful. It gives the sequel a sense of scale without requiring audiences to understand complicated narrative changes. Nigel remained one of the franchise's most recognizable comic elements. His dramatic personality, exaggerated hatred, and increasingly ridiculous attempts at revenge made him an easy character to remember. Gabi's presence amplified that comedy by creating an emotional dynamic Nigel could barely understand. Audience reactions to animated films are often shaped differently from critical reactions. Families may care about whether children are entertained, whether the characters are memorable, whether the songs are enjoyable, and whether the story has enough energy to hold attention. Critics may focus more heavily on structure, originality, pacing, and thematic consistency. Rio 2 exists directly in that space between expectations. Its music and visual style helped create an identity beyond the plot. Even viewers who might not remember every story beat can remember the colors, the songs, the birds, and the Amazon environment. That is an important form of cultural persistence. Animated films often survive not because every narrative detail remains culturally dominant, but because individual images and characters become attached to childhood memories. The long-term visibility of Rio 2 is therefore connected to nostalgia. A generation that encountered Blue and Jewel as children can revisit the franchise later and experience it through a different emotional lens. What once felt like colorful entertainment can become a reminder of a particular era of animation. The environmental message also gives the movie continued relevance. Habitat destruction has not become less important since the film's release. If anything, environmental awareness has become more central to conversations among younger audiences. That does not automatically make Rio 2 a major environmental film, but it does mean the theme remains recognizable. The Brazilian setting also contributes to the film's cultural identity. Mainstream American animation has often relied heavily on familiar American or European fantasy environments. Rio and Rio 2 instead place Brazilian culture and landscapes at the center of their visual and musical worlds. The representation is not without limitations, and the film simplifies complex cultural realities for family entertainment, but its setting still matters. What viewers remember most may not always be what critics considered most important. A child may remember Blue falling into chaos, Nigel being ridiculous, or a particular song. An adult rewatching the movie may remember Blue's fear that his family will change. Both experiences are valid because the film was designed to operate at multiple levels. Part 9. Critical analysis. The divide between critics and audiences becomes particularly interesting with a film like Rio 2. A critic looking for a tightly structured narrative can easily identify problems. There are many characters. There are multiple subplots. Nigel's revenge story competes with Blue's family conflict. The environmental storyline introduces another major threat. Musical numbers interrupt and accelerate the narrative. The movie is busy, but busy does not automatically mean ineffective. For younger viewers, that abundance can feel like energy rather than clutter. There is always something happening. There are songs, animals, jokes, emotional conflicts, competitions, action sequences, and visual spectacle. The same density that frustrates an adult critic can entertain a child. The first Rio also creates an unavoidable comparison. The original has a relatively focused emotional structure built around Blue and Jewel. Rio 2 expands the ensemble and therefore sacrifices some of that simplicity. The sequel is less intimate because it wants to be larger. That is both its strength and its weakness. Animation remains one of its strongest areas. The characters are expressive, the environments are colorful, and the large-scale flight sequences provide visual spectacle. Music similarly receives significant attention because it is essential to the franchise's identity. Voice performances help maintain the characters' personalities, even as the story becomes crowded. The environmental message is another point where audience age matters. A child may understand the basic idea that cutting down the rainforest is bad. An adult may notice the more complicated relationship between conservation, human development, and cultural identity. The movie does not fully explore those complexities, but it introduces them. The strongest defense of Rio 2 is therefore not that it is secretly perfect. It is that its ambition is more interesting than its execution sometimes allows. The movie is trying to be a family comedy, musical, environmental adventure, sequel, romance, parenting story, and identity drama at the same time. It does not always balance those elements smoothly, but the attempt gives the film more to discuss than its reputation might suggest. The weaknesses are real. There are too many competing storylines. Nigel's revenge plot is intentionally ridiculous, but its exaggerated nature can make the main environmental threat feel less serious by comparison. Blue's insecurity can become repetitive because the movie returns to the same fear in multiple forms. Eduardo's hostility is understandable conceptually, but sometimes simplistic dramatically. The tonal shifts can also be jarring. The film may present the destruction of an ecosystem and then quickly return to a joke. For a family movie, tonal flexibility is understandable, but emotional consequences can become diluted when the story refuses to sit with them. Romance is also less central than in the first movie, which is logical because Blue and Jewel are already established as a couple. Yet viewers who loved the original primarily for their relationship may find the sequel's emotional center less focused. The environmental storyline arguably deserved more weight. The idea that an endangered species is losing its habitat is serious enough to carry an entire movie. Instead, it shares attention with several comedic subplots. The result is a message that is clear but not always emotionally developed. And yet these criticisms should not be used to dismiss the film entirely. Rio 2 is a product of a particular animated sequel culture. Studios wanted recognizable characters, accessible humor, musical sequences, celebrity voices, and larger worlds. The movie delivers those things. Its formula is visible, but formula is not automatically the enemy of enjoyment. The more useful criticism is that the film could have trusted its strongest idea more. Blue's identity conflict is compelling. Jewel's relationship with her roots is compelling. Eduardo's fear of cultural loss is compelling. The environmental conflict is compelling. If the movie had given fewer secondary plots and more space to those central tensions, the result could have been substantially stronger. Part 10. Industry impact. From a business perspective, Rio 2 made sense almost immediately. The first film had established a recognizable brand, recognizable characters, and a musical identity that could support another theatrical release. Sequels in animation are attractive because audiences already understand the basic premise. The marketing does not have to introduce everything from scratch. The sequel's larger setting also created new promotional opportunities. The Amazon could be presented as a major visual event. New animals, new characters, new songs, and new environments gave marketers plenty of material. Blue and Jewel remained recognizable anchors, while the children and supporting characters expanded the franchise. Family audiences are particularly important commercially, because a successful animated film can attract multiple generations at once. Parents bring children, older siblings may recognize the franchise, and music can create appeal beyond the youngest audience. A sequel therefore benefits from familiarity, while still needing enough novelty to justify the ticket. The Brazilian setting also provided international appeal. The franchise had a visual identity rooted in a recognizable global location, rather than a generic fantasy kingdom. That differentiation could help Rio 2 stand apart from other animated properties. From Blue Sky's perspective, Rio 2 represented another attempt to establish a durable animated property. The studio had a portfolio of recognizable films, but franchises are especially valuable because characters can return across multiple projects and products. Blue and Jewel offered that possibility. The sequel also demonstrated the limits of franchise expansion. A contained story can be emotionally satisfying because its characters have one clear problem. Once a sequel introduces children, extended families, new villains, environmental threats, and multiple settings, the narrative becomes more difficult to control. That tension exists throughout Rio 2. Commercially, expanding the world is logical. Creatively, expansion creates risk. The more elements a sequel adds, the more difficult it becomes to make every element feel necessary. The film's music and character designs also provide merchandising potential. Animated characters can exist beyond the theatrical experience through toys, clothing, home entertainment, and digital visibility. Even when a franchise does not become a giant long-running universe, recognizable characters can have a commercial life that extends beyond the movie itself. Rio 2 therefore fits comfortably into the larger industry movement toward established intellectual property. It is not a radical reinvention of animated filmmaking. It is a polished example of how studios could take a successful original concept and expand it into a broader family property. Part 11. Legacy. Historically, Rio 2 is not usually placed alongside the most revolutionary animated films of its generation, and that is fair. It did not transform computer animation or redefine what an animated sequel could be. But historical significance does not always require revolution. Sometimes a film is useful because it represents a trend. Rio 2 captures the early 2010s animation industry's interest in global settings, celebrity voice casts, musical storytelling, environmental themes, and franchise expansion. It demonstrates how a studio could combine those ingredients into a family-oriented commercial product. Its place within Blue Sky's filmography also matters. The studio was capable of moving between different worlds and tones, and Rio gave it an opportunity to build something visually tied to Brazilian culture. The sequel continued that identity rather than abandoning it. The environmental messaging also places the film within a broader tradition of animated stories, using entertainment to introduce ecological ideas to younger audiences. Rio 2 does not present a sophisticated environmental thesis, but it does connect habitat destruction to the survival of characters children are encouraged to care about. The film's musical approach connects it to a longer tradition of animation, in which songs are not merely decoration but part of the storytelling language. Its Brazilian-inspired rhythms give the franchise a distinctive sound and separate it from animated films built around entirely Western pop conventions. At the same time, some aspects of Rio 2 are clearly tied to its era. The celebrity-heavy voice culture of the early 2010s is obvious. The pacing reflects a period when animated films often tried to maintain constant stimulation. Some jokes feel designed for immediate reaction rather than long-term resonance. But the emotional themes remain surprisingly durable. Blue's insecurity is timeless because fear of not being enough is timeless. The parenting conflict remains relevant because parents constantly struggle with how much protection to provide and how much freedom to allow. Jules' desire to reconnect with her roots remains relevant because people continue asking how much of their identity comes from ancestry and how much comes from experience. The environmental theme has perhaps become even more relevant. The Amazon remains one of the world's most important ecological regions, and conversations about habitat loss have only grown more urgent. For adults revisiting the film, the biggest difference is perspective. Children may watch Blue's awkwardness and laugh. Adults may recognize the anxiety behind it. Children may see Jules' excitement as an adventure. Adults may see a mother trying to make sure her children inherit something meaningful. Children may see Eduardo as an intimidating father. Adults may recognize a person whose rigidity is rooted in fear. That is the strange advantage of animation. The movie stays the same while the viewer changes. Part 12. Final reflection. So, is Rio 2 a great sequel? Not exactly. It is messier than the original. It contains too many characters, too many competing subplots, and a villain storyline that can feel disconnected from the emotional seriousness of the environmental conflict. Some jokes have aged unevenly, and the pacing rarely allows the movie to breathe for long. If your definition of a great animated film requires perfect narrative focus, Rio 2 is probably not going to qualify. But if we judge it by ambition, there is more here than first appears. The sequel takes characters whose original conflict was about finding love, and asks what happens after love has already been found. It turns Blue into a father and forces him to confront the difference between protecting his family and controlling his family. It gives Jewel a reason to reconnect with her roots without making that reconnection inherently incompatible with her marriage. It introduces children who naturally represent a mixture of worlds. It gives Eduardo a worldview based on cultural preservation, and turns Nigel into a comic example of what happens when the past becomes an obsession. Most importantly, the movie understands that Blue does not need to become someone else. His greatest victory is not becoming the strongest macaw in the Amazon. It is recognizing that the qualities that made him different can also make him valuable. That makes the film's environmental message stronger than it might initially seem. Nature is not something the characters need to conquer. It is something they need to understand and protect. The rainforest is not valuable because it belongs to the macaws. It is valuable because it is alive, interconnected, and essential to countless forms of existence. Jewel's journey is equally important because she refuses the false choice between family and heritage. She can love Blue and still love where she came from. She can raise children in Rio and still want them to understand the Amazon. Her identity becomes larger rather than narrower. If I were judging Rio 2 purely as a piece of storytelling, I would probably place it below the first movie. The original has a cleaner emotional structure and a more focused journey. But if I were judging the sequel as a film that gives us ideas worth revisiting, it becomes much more interesting. The animation remains vibrant. The music remains one of the franchise's biggest strengths. The characters are memorable. The family dynamic gives Blue and Jewel a new dimension. The Amazon setting expands the visual world. And underneath all of that is a surprisingly relatable question about whether changing yourself for the people you love eventually means losing yourself. That is why Rio 2 deserves more credit than simple nostalgia allows. It is not a perfect film. It is not a hidden masterpiece. It is a crowded, energetic, sometimes uneven animated sequel with genuine thematic ambition. And maybe that is exactly why it is worth revisiting. Because the older you get, the harder it becomes to divide life into simple categories. Home is not always one place. Family is not always one tradition. Identity is not always one culture. And belonging is not necessarily about finding the one environment where you finally fit perfectly. Blue begins the story believing that protecting his family means keeping everything stable. Jewel begins it believing that protecting her children's identity means reconnecting them with their roots. Eduardo believes protecting his species means preserving tradition. Nigel believes protecting his pride means destroying the person who embarrassed him. By the end, all of those ideas have been challenged. Blue learns that love cannot depend on control. Jewel learns that returning to the past does not require abandoning the present. Eduardo learns that tradition can survive without demanding sameness. And Nigel, perhaps most tragically beneath all the comedy, never learns that the past can be left behind. That contrast is what makes the ending work. Because belonging is not the same thing as possession. You do not belong somewhere because you control it. You belong because you understand it, contribute to it, care about it, and allow it to change you without demanding that it erase everything you were before. That is true of families. It is true of cultures. It is true of communities. And, in the context of Rio 2, it is true of nature. Blue's final transformation is therefore not about becoming wild. It is about becoming comfortable with the fact that he is neither completely wild nor completely humanized. He is something in between. His children are something in between. His family exists between worlds. And maybe that is the point. Because most of us eventually discover that we are between worlds too. We grow up with one version of ourselves, then move into another. We inherit expectations from our families, then question them. We carry traditions we love while rejecting others that no longer fit. We leave places and later realize that those places never really left us. As children, we often want one clear answer to the question, where do I belong? As adults, we slowly realize the answer can be more complicated. Maybe you belong in more than one place. Maybe you can love where you came from without returning to exactly who you were. Maybe you can build a new home without betraying the old one. And maybe the strongest identity is not the one that chooses a single world, but the one capable of connecting several. That is what Blue eventually learns. He does not have to become Eduardo. He does not have to defeat Roberto. He does not have to abandon Rio. He does not have to reject the Amazon. He simply has to stop believing that one part of himself makes the others invalid. And when he finally flies beside Jewel again, the image means more than two birds traveling through the sky. It becomes a visual summary of everything the movie has been trying to say. They are moving forward while carrying their past with them. They are together without being identical. They are returning home without having only one home. So maybe the real question Rio 2 leaves us with is not, where do you belong? Maybe it is something harder. Where do you belong when you no longer fit into only one world? Because sooner or later, most of us have to answer that for ourselves. And perhaps the answer is not choosing one side. Perhaps it is learning how to fly between them.